themselves. Now we'll talk about payment procedures. So we start out looking at income tax withholding and FICA. So the employer withholds every employee's income taxes and the employee's share of FICA employment taxes, the FICA OASDI and the FICA Medicare. And then the employer themselves will match the FICA withheld and pay the full cost of FUTA and SUTA. And so they withhold the amount from the employer, from the employee, when they write their when they issue their paychecks, and then that also creates a liability for them to send that money to the government, and then they do that and they send what they withheld from the employee as well as their own portion of the FICA and their FUTA and SUTA. And that happens regularly with each paycheck. As far as Social Security and Medicare, so this is that FICA OASDI and FICA Medicare, the 2022 tax rate is 6.2% of the first $147,000 of wages, and Medicare is 1.45% of all wages. If the employee is over withheld for Social Security, the excess is a refundable credit. So if somehow they accidentally have more than that withheld, the excess would be refundable. As far as the federal withholding for the income tax goes, when an employee is hired by a company, they'll fill out a W-4 indicating what their marital status is and any withholding allowances, and then the employer uses that information to determine how much should be withheld, how much income tax should be withheld from each check. And then at the end of the year, the employer will issue a W-2, and that summarizes the employee's wages, income tax that was withheld, and all of the FICA tax that was withheld for them and issued or sent to the government for them. And so that employer sends a copy of that W-2 to the government as well as to the employee, and then they use that to file their taxes. And it is required that it's issued by January 31st following the year end, so that the employer or employee can then use that information to file their taxes. For any taxpayer, that whether they're employee or self-employed, that is going to owe at least $1,000 in taxes for the year and meets none of the exceptions, they're required to make quarterly payments. So typically that will be self-employed individuals, but there will be instances where an employee might also have a tax obligation, and so if they're going to have a tax obligation, they should be making quarterly payments. To avoid penalties for underpayment, they should pay the smaller of 90% of the current year's tax or 100% of last year's tax. So there's an exception. It was increased to 110% of last year's tax if AGI last year exceeded $150,000. So if your adjusted gross income was greater than $150,000, it's increased to 110% to try to, cover their bases better. So the estimated tax payments happen April 15th, June 15th, September 15th, and January 15th of the following year. So that's because, if the first quarter is January, February, March, so that gives them from March 31st until April 15th to pay the estimated tax payment of the first quarter. And so that's why if December 31st ends the last quarter, that's giving them 15 days to make that estimated tax payment for the fourth quarter. As far as self-employment tax goes, taxpayers with net self-employment earnings of at least $400 must pay self-employment tax, and the 2022 rates and base amount is 15.3% for the first 147,000 of self-employment income and 2.9% of net self-employment income for Medicare. And you'll notice that that was twice the rate that an employee pays on their wages. And so that means when you're self-employed, you're paying your own half of it as well as the employer's half, because we said that the employer would match the FICA taxes. So if you're self-employed, you're doing both the employee and the employer portion of FICA. However, the taxpayer receives a deduction from net self-employment income of 15.3% for the purposes of calculating the actual self-employment tax. And the taxpayer receives a 4 AGI deduction of 50% of the self-employment tax paid. So they're reducing their adjusted gross income by the employer portion of the tax that they had to pay. So it kind of offsets that increased expense to the employer for being self-employed. There's additional Medicare taxes on high-income individuals. So an additional 0.9% on wages received in excess of specified amounts, and an additional 3.8% on unearned income. The 9% Medicare tax is imposed when wages received are in excess of $250 for MFJ, $125 for MFS, and $200 for all other taxpayers. The additional tax on a joint return is based on the combined wages of the employee and the spouse. And it also applies to self-employed individuals. Net earnings from self-employment is used for the threshold computation. The additional 3.8% is imposed on unearned income of individuals, estates, and trusts. So net investment income tax, or NIT, is 3.8% of the lesser of net investment income, or the excess of modified adjusted gross income, MAGI, over the $250 for MFJ, $125 for MFS, or $200 for all other taxpayers. And that's in addition to or on top of the 0.9% Medicare tax on wages or self-employment income. So in general, the net investment income includes interest, dividends, annuities, royalties, rents, and net gains from the sale of investment property, less related deductions. And MAGI, or modified adjusted gross income, is adjusted gross income plus foreign income exclusion. And so that just means that any individuals that don't have any excluded foreign earned income, that MAGI is the same as AGI. And I think that does it.